in your outline. So Ecclesiastes chapter 2, and picking up the story with Solomon chapter 2, verse 1. I said in my heart, go to now, I will prove or test thee with mirth. He's saying, I'm going to test my heart with mirth. Therefore, enjoy pleasure, and behold, this also is vanity or emptiness. I said of laughter, pleasure, it is mad, and of mirth, what doeth it? I sought in my heart to give myself into wine, yet acquainted my heart with wisdom until I hold on folly, till I might see what was that good for the sons of men, which they should do under the heaven all the days of their life. I made me great works. I builded me houses. I planted the vineyards. I made me gardens and orchards. And I planted trees in them of all kind of fruits. I made me pools of water that could be cisterns or perhaps even fountains to water therewith the wood, that is the trees, the fruit-bearing trees that bring forth trees. I got me servants and maidens and had servants born in my house. Also I had great possessions of great and small cattle above all that were in Jerusalem before me. I gathered me also silver and gold and the peculiar treasure of kings and of the provinces. I gat me men singers and women singers and the delights of the sons of men as musical instruments and that of all sorts. And so I was great, and increased more than all that were before me in Jerusalem, and also my wisdom remained with me. Whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my portion of all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought, and on the labor that I had labored to do, and behold, all was vanity, and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. And I turned myself to behold wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do that cometh after the king, even that which hath been already done? And then I saw that wisdom excelleth folly, as far as light excelleth darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walketh in darkness. And I myself perceived also that one event happened to them all. And then said I in my heart, as it happeneth to the fool, so it happeneth even to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart, that this is also vanity. For there is no remembrance of the wise more than of the fool forever, seeing that which now in the days to come shall all be forgotten. And how dieth the wise man? As the fool. And therefore I hated life, because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous unto me, for all is vanity and vexation of spirit. Yea, I hated all my labor, which I had taken under the sun, because I should leave it unto the man that should be after me. And who knoweth, whether he shall be a wise man or a fool? And yet shall he have rule over all my labor, wherein I have labored, and wherein I have showed myself wise under the sun. This is also vanity. And therefore I went about to cause my heart to despair of all the labor which I took under the sun. For there is a man whose labor is in wisdom and in knowledge and in equity. And yet to a man that hath not labored, therein shall he leave it for his portion. This also is vanity and of a great evil. For what hath man of all his labor, and of the vexation of his heart, wherein he hath labored under the sun? For all his days are sorrows, and his travail grief. Yea, his heart taketh not rest in the night. This is also vanity. There is nothing better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that he should make his soul enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw, that it was from the hand of God. For who can eat, or who else can hasten hereunto more than I? For God giveth to a man that is good in his sight wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner he giveth travail to gather and to heap up, that he may give to him that is good before God. This also is vanity and vexation of spirit. When you read that, you almost want to say, well, what use is it, right? What good is going to come of all this? I want to fill in your outline, if you'll allow me to do so, and work through this just quickly. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time in review, but Ecclesiastes records the musings of a miserable old man. Now, you can't call Solomon a fool. He certainly wasn't a fool. He was the wisest, if not the wisest man that ever lived, apart from the Lord Jesus Christ. And yet when you read Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and you read the introduction there, he introduces himself as the preacher, or we could say the messenger or the proclaimer or the teacher, the son of David, king of Jerusalem. And then he writes, the sum of his life at this time in life. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher. Vanity of vanity, all is vanity. Solomon came to his old age, and he came to the realization that you and I should be very conscious of when we read in the book of James, for instance, whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away. From the eldest in this room, I would think most of us look back on our lives now and we wonder where life went. One day we were young, and the next day we are old. And we look back on the passage of time, and we look at our children growing up, and the baby of the family might be in their 40s or in their 50s, and you wonder, what happened? How did this happen? I remember when I was young hearing the old people say that time is rushing on. And certainly it is. Let me give you some thoughts then as we start going to the outline. Ecclesiastes then chronicles the ponderings of the wisest of men to have lived. And that's one thing that we need to have resonating within us. When Solomon was a young man, there was a characteristic of his life that we should all desire, and that is his love for the law of God. We read in Psalm 119, the psalmist writing in verse 97, "Oh, how love I thy law. The law, is my meditation all the day." 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 3, Solomon loved the Lord, and he walking in the statutes of David, his father. 1 Kings 3 and verse 5, in Gibeon, where he went to be with the Lord apart from all the others, away from the palace in Jerusalem, a place where kings were crowned. We read, in Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask what I shall give thee." Here's a question for you. If you were asked that question today, what would your answer be? As for anything in the world, and I'll give it to you. Are you old enough today and wise enough that it wouldn't be riches, and it wouldn't be fame, it wouldn't be possessions, it wouldn't be talent, it would be the wisdom of the Lord? 1 Kings 3, verse 9 through 10, Solomon's request, "Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart, to judge thy people. And then this, that I may discern between the good and the bad. For who is able to judge this thy so great a people?" 1 Kings 11, somebody would ask, what happened to Solomon? Well, the answer is in 1 Kings 11 and verse 4. "And it came to pass when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods. And his heart was not perfect or whole with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father." We often think about David, and when I mention King David, the first thing that comes to mind is Bathsheba, right? Invariably it is. But that's not how he ended his life. You know, everybody in this room has made mistakes, choices that we regret. Things that we wish there was a replay button like the old VCRs used to have, right? And you could run it back and you could actually record over it and get a fresh run at it. Well, that doesn't even exist anymore, so you can forget that. But David came to his old age, reaping the consequences of his sins, and nevertheless his heart was set on the Lord. Solomon comes to his old age, and all he does is look at life and say, it's empty, it's empty, it's empty. Let me fill in some. The book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes afford us two perspectives of life and happiness. The book of Proverbs is the book written by a young father who excelled in wisdom like no other man before him or after him. The book of Ecclesiastes, though, is the same man looking back from his old age on life and looking at life and just saying empty, 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 empty. And so Ecclesiastes 1, and this is just for a quick review for those that weren't here last week. Ecclesiastes 1 gives us 4 principles for starting or jump-starting life. And it's not on the outline, but let me just give it to you. The first is this. Here's the principle. Your perspective on life affects your contentment. However happy you are or however unhappy you are today, it has to do with your perspective. The perspective of a believer ought to be what? Heavenly and eternal. But we find ourselves deeply rooted sometimes in this world. The second, a life lived apart from God is never satisfied. That's why Solomon comes to the end of his life and he says, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. He's lived his life with all of these wives and their idols, and he has been drawn away by those wives, the lust of the flesh, the idolatry, and he's abandoned the very one that could give him joy and hope, and that was the Lord. Thirdly, it's not your chronological age, but your spiritual perspective that dictates your outlook on life. In this room here, whether you're young or whether you're old, it's ultimately your perspective, your spiritual perspective on life. Last week I had Marsh shared with us about Peggy. Peggy Pemberton passed away back in September, and she always came in bubbly and zeal and all, and I mean chronologically she was an old lady, but she was not in her mind. She was still young, and young in the Lord, loving the Lord, growing in the Lord. Number 4, living in the past will rob you of your joy and passion for life. Living in the past will rob you of your joy and passion for life. When you look at Solomon, you look at a man living with regrets. When you look at David, you're looking at a man that lived with an eternal hope. Now, Solomon obviously knew the Lord. He called upon the Lord. He worshiped the Lord, but he backslid. And as a result of that, there was a great sorrow that he carried in life. And so as we dive into chapter 2, here's my question to you this morning. Are you happy or are you sad? Are you rejoicing or are you depressed? Now, if you sit around watching Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, I can tell you who you are. You're depressed, right? When I heard that Paula White is the head of the faith office in the White House, I thought, gag me for a moment here, 3 times divorced and remarried, and remember a church without walls, and just a trail of scandal. And I thought, wow, this is not beginning well on the side of faith. But that's not the point. Let's move on. Here we go. I got to fly in. I might end up with the class going next week, so those of you that are in here. Disappointed in his pursuit of wisdom and knowledge, Solomon focused on other pursuits in Ecclesiastes 2. Get this. In Ecclesiastes 1, he said, I pursued wisdom and I pursued knowledge. Vanity of vanities. He comes to Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and he says, well, forget the wisdom and the knowledge. I'm going to enjoy life. Tonight, there is a big game, right? I don't even know who's playing. Is it tonight, the Super Bowl? Tonight's the Super Bowl, right? Now, I'm going to ask you tomorrow, who cares? But all the world is going to be focused, right, on the big game, the big game. And sadly, you and I, living in here in Tampa Bay, we've known the Bucs when they've gone and won the Super Bowl. And we know There's the exhilaration for the moment, and then life returns to normal. All right. Disappointed in life, Solomon pursued other things. What did he pursue? The first thing he did was he pursued pleasure, only to conclude it is mad. No, he did not go to Disney World, but he pursued whatever he thought would make him happy. All right, here we read, I said in my heart, go to now, I will prove thee with mirth, with pleasure, and enjoy pleasure. And then he said, after trying that and there was no happiness, he finally said, it is mad. It is empty. Here's another. He then turned to folly. So he decided to leave Disney World, and it's a small world after all. And he decided, well, I'm going to run with the fools. So he started going to the bars. And you know what? I'm putting it in our culture. But he gave himself to the folly of fools. Here's what we read about that. Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and verse 3. And I sought in my heart to give myself unto wine. Now the parallel of wine today would be what? Not just alcohol. Drugs, pharmaceuticals. Do you realize among the senior citizens today, one of the characteristics of senior citizens is how many, the majority of whom, are on some kind of medication to help with them with their anxiety. Now, you might be one of those people, but I would ask you to check out where your spiritual perspective is. What are you and who are you looking to for joy? Solomon said, well, I turned to the drug of my day, and that was wine. And yet, he says, and it left me despairing. And then a second one, he played the fool with the sons of men, leaving him hollow and unfulfilled. When I read that phrase here, I'm going to read it. I sought in my heart to give myself into wine, yet acquainted my heart with wisdom, and to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was that good for the sons of men, which they should do unto the Son, having all the days of their life. When I read that, most of us are past this, but I think about midlife crisis. Right? If I get a new wife, or I get a new car, or I get a new job, or I got to do something new, and I'm going to pursue different friends, and the result is this: you run with fools, and you're going to be a fool. You run with skunks, and you're going to smell like one. Right? Here's another. Then he said, well, I know what? I'm going to seek to make a name for myself. And so he sought greatness and fame in his accomplishments. Ecclesiastes 2, verses 4 through 6. I made me great works. I builded me houses. What would that first part be? What did he start doing trying to find purpose and fulfillment? Building houses. So he turned to architecture. Now, you and I would think about building a house, but for a king, you would think about building a palace or building the temple or building other palaces. Solomon is known for being a man that had many stables, many horses, many chariots. And so he started building and building and building, and he tried to find happiness in that. Then what did he do after he turned to architecture? What was the second thing he did? He started turning to agriculture. And so he said, and I planted me vineyards. I worked in my yard. I planted me flowers. I had fruit trees in the backyard. And, was there happiness in that? And the answer was no. Let me finish it up. I made me pools of water to water therewith the wood that bringeth forth trees. So he's turning to all these things, and there still wasn't happiness. And then he turned to assets. He looked at his portfolio and said, you know what? Maybe if I just had more money, if I had more gold, if I had more silver, then I would be happy. And so he says in Ecclesiastes 2 and verse 7, I got me servants and maidens. I had employees, we would put in our culture today, and had servants born in my house. Also, I had great possessions and small cattle above all that were in Jerusalem before me. So he turned to assets and hoping that they they would give him happiness. He goes on in verse 8, silver and gold, peculiar treasure. And then he decided, you know what? I'm going to be Steve Armstrong. I'm going to have an orchestra and a choir. Maybe that's going to make a difference. And got me singers and women singers and the lights of the sons of men as musical instruments, and that of all sorts. And then we go on in verses 9 and 10, and then he finally says of himself, and so was I great. But you can be great and not be happy. All right? One of the things we've known about the White House and Congress in Washington over the years, it is populated with drunkards, drug addicts, and pedophilia. All manner of adultery. I'm hoping the Epstein list is going to come out. And you should too, because Washington, D.C. is the absolute pinnacle of moral corruptness and depravity. So I'm hoping it'll all come out. Then we can replace the whole bunch of them. All right, moving on. And then he says in verse 10, I'm king. And so whatever I want, I can have. And I kept not from me. I withheld not from my heart any joy, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor. And this was my portion of all my labor. So, wow, we've built buildings, we've built orchards, we have assets of silver and gold. We are, in Solomon's words, I'm the king and I can have whatever I want. And then we read in verse 11, and then I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought and on the labor that I had labored to do, and behold, what? It was all vanity, and there was no profit under the sun. In other words, after all of that, it still came to nothing. Now, moving on. Solomon compared then the prospects of the wise and the foolish and concluded both face the certainty of one thing, of death. Whether the wise man or the foolish man, he says that as I come to the last years of my life, I've realized whether you're wise or foolish, we all die. Give you a quick illustration. My grandfather was in the nursing home about 15 years, a major stroke. And in those days, he didn't get the help that he should have had when he needed it. And so he ended up in this nursing home because of the loving care of my mother and her siblings. My grandfather, every day of his life in the nursing home, had somebody sitting at his bedside every day, feeding him, shaving him, combing his hair, bathing him every day of his life. And so as a result of that, he lived well past many that would be in his room. Others would come, they would be there for a season, they would die, and he continued to live. But there was one thing I watched and observed over the years. My grandfather worked hard his whole life. He would work as a farmer all during the day, and then about 2:30 in the afternoon, he'd say to Sadie, I got to go in and get a shower. He was a farmer. Got to go and get a shower. I've got to go to work. And then my granddad would travel 30 minutes and go to work. He worked in we would call it a mill today. He would work there from 4 o'clock until 12 o'clock at night. He'd get off at 12 o'clock at night. He would drive home, get home about 12:30. He would go to bed. The next morning, he would get up again and start at 7 o'clock in the morning, working in the garden, and do that every day of his life. That's all I remember as I was growing up. My point in that, he worked his whole life. But the people often in the bed beside him sometimes had hardly worked a day in their life. But they received the same care that he did. The difference was that my family was exhausting all of its acreage and all that my granddad had worked for his whole life. Between him and grandmother, 200 acres was lost, 2 houses were lost, all to pay the government so that they could be in the nursing home. On the other hand, the people who had hardly worked at all that were in his room, the government was paying for them. And so you look at that and you have to say, vanity of vanity, all is vanity, right? The difference was that my grandfather had something that money couldn't buy, and that was love. That was love. Moving on. All right, so we go to Ecclesiastes 2 and verse 12. And so I turned myself to behold wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do that cometh after the king? Now, who's going to come after the king? That's an easy question. His son, who will be the king. So he's talking now about inheritance. Y'all with me? All right. All of you have wills here, right? So you've already thought through the inheritance problem, unless you're living in absolute denial. All right, here we go. Verse 12. And I turned myself to behold wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do that cometh after the king? Even that which hath been already done. In other words, I have done so much that my son will never rise above me. I will not be in his shadow, if you would. So let's go through this here. Solomon then considered wisdom and folly. And so in Ecclesiastes 2 and verse 13, and then I saw that wisdom excelleth folly as far as light excelleth darkness. We agree with that. He's pursued both in life. I've pursued wisdom, Ecclesiastes 1. Ecclesiastes 2, I pursued folly. And I've decided, you know what? Wisdom is far better than folly, and light is far better than darkness. Now, in verse 14, the wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walketh in darkness. And I must have perceived also that one even happeneth to them all. What is he talking about in verse 14? He's talking about death. Whether it's the wise or the foolish, you die. There's no other alternative. There might be the one. There is the one, and that is, I believe, the rapture, and I'm waiting for that. But if the Lord doesn't come, you've got one alternative in life, and that is death. You with me? If anybody knows another alternative, let me know, all right, besides the hope of the rapture. All right, then, here we go, verse 15. Then said I in my heart, as it happeneth to the fool, so it happeneth to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart that this also is vanity. What happens to the fool happens to me. We both die. We both die. Can I keep going? I want to get to inheritance. I think it pops up here in a minute. All right. Solomon concluded that the remembrance of the wise and the foolish is soon forgotten. I have visited my ancestors in cemeteries in the middle of a farm field. I have visited my ancestors when the woods have overtaken the cemetery. And if it were not for my research or the work and the history of others, there are ancestors of my lineage that are essentially forgotten, as well as the places that they're buried. The same thing is true of yours. Whether you're rich or you're famous, there will be a day when the people of fame will walk into a cemetery and they'll say, you know, I think Spurgeon was buried here somewhere, but I don't know where. And so like I did in England, I go up to someone in London and I said, do you know where Spurgeon is buried? Spurgeon who? You know, the greatest preacher, the greatest Baptist preacher of all time, that's Spurgeon. Whether young or famous, or whether famous or infamous, invariably you'll be forgotten. Moving on. There is an eternal difference, though, between that of the wise and the foolish and how they end life. And I wanted to make that as a point of difference here. The difference between the wise and foolish. So I'm going to go back one. Solomon says, I look at life, and sooner or later, we're all forgotten. And he says in verse 17, in fact, I hated life, because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous unto me, for all is vanity and vexation of spirit. In other words, I've done everything I can to make a great name for myself, and invariably somebody's going to come after me and perhaps even tear it down. Vexation. And yet for those of us who know the Lord, we have this hope. Surely he shall not be moved forever. The righteous shall be in everlasting remembrance. We may not be remembered on this earth, but we as a believer will always be remembered in the heart of God. Another, Proverbs 10 and verse 7, the memory of the just is blessed, but the name of the wicked shall rot. The wicked is driven away in his wickedness, but the righteous hath hope in his death. I've been at the bedside of many Hillsdale members that have died over the years. And one of the legacies that I remember as I reflect is how many of them died with a steadfast, eternal hope, that you and I might have the same. And then, here we go. I want to wrap it up. I have about 8 minutes on this. You can't take it with you. Can't take it with you. I used to say that I've never seen a U-Haul or heard of a U-Haul going to a cemetery. But I cannot say that anymore because I heard of a man that had literally eaten himself to death. And they had to have a U-Haul truck take him to the cemetery because the hearse could not hold him. So I can no longer say you'll never see a U-Haul going to a cemetery. Here we go. Let me give you some thoughts and I'll close. For all his labor, Solomon realized he would leave everything to another. Ecclesiastes 2 and verse 18, yea, I hated all my labor which I had taken unto the sun, because I should leave it unto the man that shall be after me. Who's he talking about? His son, his heirs. So he says, I look at all that I've labored under the sun and I hate it, because all that I've done I'm going to leave to another man. You say, now why? What a bad attitude. Well, depends on who your heir is, right? I've been here long enough. I've seen children get their parents' inheritance, what mom and dad had worked their whole life to save, and I've seen those children wasted in 2 to 3 years, and it's gone because of the character of their children. Now, here's, we'll continue with that. Ecclesiastes 2 and verse 19. And who knoweth whether he, my son, shall be a wise man or a fool? Now, does anybody in here, and we all have children for the most part, is there anyone in here that can guarantee me that your son or daughter will live the rest of their life as a wise man or woman? You can't. Because your children have free will. They're going to choose their course in life. And I've seen people live up to be in their 70s and maybe even in their 80s, and all of a sudden they turn out to be a fool. Right? You have too, if you'd be honest. So let's look at what he says. Ecclesiastes 2, verse 19. It's so nice to have the prime timers in here, so I can rant at 2 groups at one time, right? Ecclesiastes 2 and verse 19. If the teenagers were sitting in here, they would think, I don't even know what this means. What does this mean? Yet one day they're going to want your inheritance. All right, anyway, Ecclesiastes 2, verse 19. Who knoweth whether he shall be a wise man or a fool? Yet shall he have rule. My son, my heirs, shall have rule over all my labor, wherein I have labored, and wherein I have showed thyself wise under the sun. This is also vanity. So he says, I'm going to die. I'm going to leave everything that I have to somebody else. And I don't know if they're going to be a wise man or going to be a fool. I've labored for it all my life, and they haven't labored at all. I just give it to them. All right? Verse 20 and 21. Therefore, I went about to cause my heart to despair of all the labor which I took under the sun. For there is a man, now watch this, whose labor is in wisdom and in knowledge and in equity. That is a wise man. Yet to a man that hath not labored, therein shall he leave it for his portion. This also is vanity and a great evil. Here's the point I want to make to you. As you've gone through life, you have learned. You have grown. Hopefully you are wiser. Life has by life experiences, you have been sharpened. You've got more wisdom and insight. You have worked and you've labored whatever you have. Most of us have worked and labored our whole life to have what little bit we might have. But the attitude of the American culture has always been, at least in the last century, well, I'm going to leave my children better off than me. Right? Right? But the problem is, you bestow on your children that which you have amassed through wisdom and sometimes foolishness, hard work, very little ease, so that when you get to the latter years of your life, you can somewhat say, take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. Now, don't take that as the rich fool. The rich fool was tearing down barns, building greater barns. He wasn't planning for eternity. But for the most part in this room, you're planning for the future. But not only that, you're planning probably for your children's future. But your children have a deficit in experience, and if you're not careful, in wisdom. Children that are growing up in the American culture today are growing up in a culture of fools. They don't have wisdom. They don't have discernment. They live in a world that says, do whatever pleases you. They live in a world that says, do whatever makes you what? Happy. That's the culture. And so if your children are not cultivated spiritually to think biblically and spiritually, invariably they may revert to be what Solomon was afraid would happen to his son, and that is fools. Lastly, 22 and 23. For what hath man of all his labor, and of the vexation of his heart, wherein he hath labored under the sun? For all his days are sorrows, and his travail grief. Yea, his heart taketh not rest in the night. This is also vanity. I'll close with this. Verse 23 is a portrait of someone that worries. They can't sleep at night. They're constantly filled with anxiety and fears. For Solomon, it wasn't, am I going to have enough to make it to the end of my life? It was, everything that I've worked for, what is my son going to do with it? Is he going to be wise or is he going to be foolish? Now, I close. Solomon had a son who took over the throne of Israel. What was his name? Rehoboam. Rehoboam faced a crisis after Solomon died. And the crisis was, who am I going to listen to? Which counselors am I going to listen to? He was facing a potential of a civil war. So Rehoboam first went to his father's counselors, Solomon's counselors, and they told him, for right now, appease the people, and they will love you. Solomon then went to the young ones, counselors. They happened to be his peers. He grew up in the palace. These men, young men, grew up in the palace. And they told him, you tell the people that you're going to be hard on them and you're going to tax them and they're just going to have to accept it. I mean, after all, you're the king. And what happened? The kingdom was divided. The first son of Solomon saw the kingdom of Israel go from 12 tribes to 2 tribes. The 10 northern tribes departed. And he was left a weak king. So much more, but we don't have time. Let's pray.